Hi, I'm Laura Sheehan, and I am here today with author Steve Dalton. Steve is a senior career consultant and program director for Duke University's full-time MBA program. In 2012, Penguin Random House published his debut book, The 2-Hour Job Search. The concepts presented in that book are now taught at over 100 universities worldwide, and Steve regularly presents workshops and keynotes outlining his methods. He is a regular contributor at the Huffington Post and is regularly quoted in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, US News, Fast Company, and Financial Times, among others. In my role as a career coach and consultant, the 2-Hour Job Search is absolutely one of my go-to resources. I love it so much that I often send it to my clients so that they can utilize the amazing tools and techniques within on their own time. Believe it or not, I connected with Steve through LinkedIn. This is one of those things that I tell my clients to do all the time, and I actually did it myself. I had no other connection to Steve other than a sincere love of and respect for his work. One day, gathered the courage to reach out to him via LinkedIn, and to my great surprise and delight, he responded. Today, we are here together virtually to talk about and to tell you about the updated version of the 2-Hour Job Search, which was released in April of this year. I am so excited to have Steve with me today to tell us a little bit about his career path and the new features of his book. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. It's truly an honor for me. And we're just going to jump right into the questions. I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be here. We so often talk about our career journeys and think that they should be linear, but in fact, oftentimes looking back, find that they're not. So where did you begin and how did you end up where you are now?
Gosh, I sometimes think about how I would recreate my career path to become a career coach earlier, and there's just no direct route by which I would have ended up here. So oddly, I was a chemical engineer back in undergraduate. I was always good at math and science, and my parents said, "You should be an engineer." And I said, "I should be an engineer," and never really thought about it any more than that. Um, but then I found it, I loved the rigor and reason of it, but it just never spoke to me. I was more of a creative free thinker, but the rigorous logic was so helpful and central to kind of how I do things. So that led me to strategy consulting to apply that rigor and logic to a wider variety of challenges. That led me to business school because I wanted to have a home team that I could follow over a longer period of time. So I thought marketing would be the great fusion of logic and creativity. And then I found out that that dream career I thought I had been building toward for over a decade was a terrible fit for me. It minimized everything I was good at and accentuated everything that I'm not good at. So thankfully, what was crazy was I had always gotten my jobs through on-campus recruiting, including my marketing job. But when I wanted to leave marketing and there was no on-campus recruiting, that exposed kind of the big lie that I was ready for job searching after leaving college. I, in fact, had just gotten really good at interviewing for jobs on campuses, only to realize that I was not good at it in the real world. And I talked to people I know who seemed to like their job before I went back to the devil I knew in strategy consulting. And that led me to my old career coaches, and what they said really resonated. And they said, we have a contractor opportunity at our department. Do you want to give that a shot? And I thought, oh, this is great. I've always been a student government nerd, and I was the career affairs representative in business school. It was always the car accident I couldn't look away from. And 3 months became a year, and a year became 2 years, and 2 years became 15.
That's incredible. So really it all began with personal connections and reaching out to those people that you knew, seeking their advice, and then moving forward on opportunities that arose out of those conversations.
Absolutely. I was lucky that my intuition was to ask people for help. And because that I think is the fundamental path towards success in the modern job search, is having the wherewithal to not try to do it all yourself, but to ask smart people how they went before you.
Fantastic. So how did that then translate into the 2-hour job search?
Again, almost the right place, right time kind of circumstance. I think what dawned on me from my own experience was that I was really good at following instructions, but I wasn't really good at curating a bunch of tips. I'm kind of an awkward dude. So put yourself out there and sell yourself. Kind of these conventional wisdom nuggets never really worked for me. In fact, they were a little bit counterproductive. You don't want to see an awkward person like me sell myself. It's just not that comfortable to watch. Um, and so I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if the job search were more like instructions, more like a recipe than a list of ingredients? But then I had a job, and I kind of backburnered that thought until the financial crisis hit in 2008. I had an international student who had a job with Bear Stearns, who got acquired by JP Morgan in the spring of 2008 before the financial crisis really hit in earnest that fall in the US. And they rescinded her offer. They canceled out the Bear Stearns offers. And she suddenly was without a job. None of the other banks would talk to her. And she was without a visa. So she lost her kind of way to stay in the US. She came into my office and she was devastated. And she's like, how do I find a job? And I started giving her all the tips that I'd been given. Let's get a list of targets together. Let's figure out where you have contacts. And she's like, how do I come up with a list of targets? And I was like, oh, you want instructions. I get that. I thought the same thing. And I don't have any instructions to give you. And it was humiliating. I was watching myself let a student down in real time. And it still scars. It's still painful to think about, because I didn't have an answer for her. And that's kind of the dream scenario of a career coach. You have someone who will do exactly what you tell them. You just need something exact to say. And so I realized I was selling snake oil at that point. I either needed to leave the career services industry, or I had to answer that question for real. How exactly does a person find a job when they don't have the wherewithal to curate tips, but they have the strength somehow to still follow instructions? And that led to the multi-year development of what became the 2-hour job search.
That's amazing. And I love too how, having read the book twice now, 3 times, 10 times, that the instructions are so clear, and that you've got these great acronyms like LAMP that help you shine light literally on the prospects that are out there. And then also how to, and I really think that your formula both initially expands your options and then narrows it, so that you really start to think beyond the first 3 companies that come to mind, and get into the deeper layers, the deeper levels of a job search, and then are able to cull out or cull through and have rise to the top your best options for a job. Would you mind talking to us a little bit about the LAMP list and how you created that?
Sure. To me, one of the things that always struck me about the off-campus or non-campus job search was how there was never any strategy behind it. It was just put yourself out there, network. Uh, But before you spend hours networking, like dozens of hours networking, doesn't it make sense to spend 1 hour trying to identify who you should really be networking with? There's an infinite number of companies out there, and in an hour, you can make that infinite seeming job search very finite. You can grab a large consideration set of possible employers and then use 3 pieces of data, which are both easy to find and predictive of success, to put them into a logical order of attack, because all of the targets are not equally viable or equally likely to pay off. Either because you don't like them as much, or because just signs don't point to you having as much immediate opportunity there. So really the LAMP list is a classic diverge and then converge concept. Let's come up with a large consideration set and use data to put them into an order of attack. Ultimately, the output will be a final 5 that you will pursue simultaneously, so that you don't emit this kind of desperate aura into the marketplace, which happens when you fixate and you think your universe of possible employers is just the 3 names that everybody else can think of when they think, I need to do a job search in X.
And the job search generally can be so overwhelming that to be able to have a clear plan of attack, targets that you're going after, and then also not only identifying the best possible employers, but then you provide such great instruction on how to contact those employers. And given that 85% of jobs are still filled by word of mouth or personal connection, that strategy, that approach is so key in having success in your job search. Go ahead.
Indeed, there was a fascinating study done by Brown, Cetron, and Topa at the New York Fed. They analyzed how people were hired, and they found that for every one person who was hired through an online job posting application, 12 were hired through internal referrals. So to me, just the engineer in me can't get over those numbers, because every time you apply online, you think it's the most direct route between not having a job and having a job. But not only are you hoping you're one of the handful they choose to interview, you're hoping that it's the 1 out of 13 jobs that actually goes to the online applicant instead of an internal referral. So it's awful stacked on top of terrible. It's just those odds you can't look away from. It, while networking seems inefficient, per hour invested, it gives vastly greater returns than that same amount of time spent applying online. And it doesn't have the deteriorative effect that endlessly applying online and never hearing back does. So you get stronger when you build relationships. You get weaker when you apply online.
And in fact, you had one example of a guy named Sean who had approached an employer that didn't come to the campus interviews, I think, and so reached out through your methods to establish personal connections to that company. And I love this story because he also applied online. And he went through the whole process, and because of your methods of reaching out through personal connections, he got through 3 rounds of interviews, got the final offer. But the same day that he got the final offer, he also got that automated email from the online application system saying, "So sorry, Sean, you're not going to get the job," because the system recognized him as 2 different people: the online guy who didn't get through the screening process, and the in-person guy who got the job.
It's startling. It couldn't be laid more bare how it is just 2 separate processes entirely. I think there's this term called satisficing that I talk about in the book. Satisficing, it's a combination of it's basically, it's what prevents us from spending 6 hours in a supermarket when we're overwhelmed by all the hand soap options. We want something that satisfies. It suffices and it satisfies that need to get your hands clean, but we're not weighing 100 options to figure out what exactly is the best hand soap out there. We just need something that's good enough that smells nice. And that's how employers are thinking as well. All other things being equal, they're going to hire someone who's done this job before, but somewhere else. If that person's not available, they're just looking for someone who they can trust. So rather than wade through hundreds of applicants online and try to make a fair judgment through all these resumes, they're going to consider the handful of people that are recommended by an internal employee already, because that person's been vouched for. Someone's liked that person enough to attach their name to them and incur some personal risk, which is such a nice weed out compared to all of the perfect strangers that come in through an online job posting, many of whom are not qualified.
Right. And that point is so great for the people with whom I regularly deal, because the bulk of my clients are either expat partners or parents who have decided to stay at home for a time and raise their children. And they have inconsistent job timelines often, or they've been jumping from place to place. And so even if they've been employed consistently, it's not been on the linear path that some other people remain on. And so the methods and the personal connections that you're talking about, and I also really, it resonated with me in chapter 3 of your book. You talked about how in 2018 there was a study done, and I'm just going to quote, if that's okay, from this
Please.
part of your book. In 2018, there were 16 million businesses in the US, and 165 million jobs were had between those employers. Of those jobs, nearly 2/3 were employers with fewer than 100 employees. And then you break it down even further by saying that the bigger employers are the ones that are going to first come to mind, but they make up just 1.3% of available employers. The remaining 98.7% of employers offer paychecks, just like the largest 1.3% do. And this is where this ties in perfectly, because you said that 98.7% want good enough talent who are proactive and make it easy for them to hire them. And this especially includes those job seekers who lack directly relevant experience, ideal work references, or a steady timeline of work over the years.
It's so startling that a lot of job seekers want to believe that the job search is fair, meaning the person who is most qualified gets the job. I would disagree. The job search is not fair in that sense, but I would argue the job search is fair in a completely different sense. And that is, the job seeker that is best able to turn strangers into advocates is more likely to get the job, even over someone who is more classically qualified. But I think there are plenty of people who are classically qualified and oftentimes overqualified for these jobs. But the ability to take a stranger and turn them into an advocate on demand is useful in every job. It's one of the few universal skills in the marketplace today. So I think the people who demonstrate that ability do deserve to be able to cut the line. It's a human way of maximizing what you can contribute to an organization, but it doesn't match the traditional view of what is fair in the job search about who has the best test scores or the most consistent employment. So I think it's a different kind of fair, but I think it's one that's more representative of a realistic workplace who can build advocacy for their ideas and gain consensus.
Right. And so many people can be qualified for the job, but the real question is, does the employer want you to be a part of their team?
Mm-hmm.
Will they enjoy you, being in their office every day? Are they someone that you can depend on and rely on? And this idea of being proactive and establishing those great personal connections is so fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I love how in the book you provide exact templates on how to reach out to people that you've never met before. And so important in this COVID era, in a virtual way. You don't have to do it in person. Yeah. So tell us about that system just a little bit, not to give away all the secrets in the book, of course.
There's nothing secret in the book. That's kind of the beauty of it, is I want to pull back the curtain. I think so many books obscure their approach by being non-committal. Here's a bunch of tips, go figure it out for yourself. But for me, it's very classically a recipe. I'll give you exact instructions for what I would do. And that's where the 2-hour job search, the name itself, comes from. The 2 hours refers to the amount of time after my boss were to theoretically say, Steve, you're fired. Start looking for a job right now. Within 2 hours, I would be done for the day. I would have gotten as far in my job search as I could, starting from scratch, starting from devastation. And in that 2 hours, I could create a lamp list, identify likely targets, the targets that are most promising in terms of success and of greatest interest to me, and initiate my first batch of outreach. After first identifying who I think the most promising contacts are, my top 5 employers. So that is really what the 2-hour job search is. There's no secret. There's nothing to reveal. It is exact instructions that can be followed by anyone. That's why recipes are so beautiful. Everyone around the world can follow the same recipe and have a dish at the end that tastes basically the same if you adjust for elevation in some cases. But it's the same in France as it would be in the US, as it would be in Japan. So there's no real secret there. Now, for the outreach, I think the secret sauce of that approach is that I give job seekers permission to not sell themselves. I think we all have become such cynical consumers that we can smell a sales pitch a mile away. So when we sense a sales pitch, our guards go up. But success in the job search means systematically bringing people's guards down. And the worst way to bring people's guards down is to try to entice a stranger with stories about yourself. They don't know you. They don't care. There are so many people out there. And here's another job seeker talking about themselves. So I use this science based on my colleague at Fuqua, Dan Ariely's research on social norms versus market norms. And in a nutshell, what he identified is that you are just as likely to get help for completing a difficult endeavor when you ask purely for a favor with no compensation as you are when you offer compelling compensation. The catch is when you offer token compensation, like you don't offer a fair wage, but you don't just ask for a favor, you're much less likely to get assistance than you are in either of the other two systems. So the big lesson here is if you don't have exactly relevant experience, don't try to offer what transferable skills you have. Instead, just purely ask people for a favor. Not everyone's going to say yes, and that's totally fine. There are different kinds of contacts that you will encounter in this search, and you're going to have to kiss some frogs to find your princes in this approach. But once you find those princes, they are more than worth it, and it's just so much easier and more authentic, especially in this COVID era of just asking for a favor rather than trying to puff yourself up or impress a stranger with what you bring to the table, especially if you don't have an ideal pedigree or you've got some gaps in your experience or you've just been laid off.
Right. And when you say asking for a favor, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the gift of people's time. You're asking for insight and advice. You're not asking for job leads. Because realistically, whenever you ask someone for their insight and expertise, they know you're looking for a job. You don't need to make that explicit. And when you make it explicit, it puts a lot of pressure on a stranger. And that kind of makes the stranger not want to work with you. It's interesting. As an American, like we're notorious for being very, very blunt in many cases. But we have weird exceptions to that rule. So I think giving negative feedback, all of a sudden Americans get very squishy and we get very indirect about giving negative feedback, even though we're very blunt at other times, which can confuse the heck out of people coming from a different culture where negative feedback is more freely given in a very direct fashion. Americans are supposed to be so direct, yet we get so indirect about negative feedback. The other big exception is job searching. We're very direct about so many things, but we get very coded when it comes to the job search. So it can be very, and I think that's a more universal thing. I think it's not just an American thing. I don't think strangers like having the pressure of helping someone they can't vouch for, knowing that really the point of that conversation is a job search when they don't know if they're ready to advocate for this person. So there's a high risk of losing face in agreeing to a conversation where the stated goal up front is job search assistance. So Dan Ariely's research just basically showed that you ask a favor rather than try to sell yourself about why someone should talk to you. It's much easier, and it can be done in a very, very standardized, short, brief way without as much pain, because otherwise you're trying to guess how to sell yourself to a total stranger, and every stranger wants something different. I've listened to panels where employees will say, if you want to get my attention, you've got to list your top 3 accomplishments in bullet point format in your first email. And only to hear in a different panel someone else say, no, if you want to get my attention, you've got to think like a consultant for me and tell me how you're going to save my company money or make us more money when you reach out to me for the first time. The problem is what works for one of those people won't work for the other, and there's no way for a job seeker to know who is who. So not everybody is receptive to just being asked nakedly for the gift of their time, but the people who are, that simple, sincere, authentic approach works for enough of them where it makes it worth a job seeker's while, and it's just so much less painful than repeatedly putting yourself out there trying to sell yourself and getting ignored or shot down is.
And the whole process can be so stressful when you're asking for a job versus if you're asking for advice on how to best position yourself for a particular position. I also love this repeated metaphor or simile to baking, cooking, baking specifically. And in your book, you note that cooking is one thing, baking is another. And that to cook, it's like being a maverick in the kitchen, that you can be throwing things into a pan and adding things as you need to, and adjusting your course as you go. And sometimes it turns out okay, and sometimes it doesn't, and you have to be prepared for those results. Whereas baking is a precise set of instructions and steps that you have to follow. And it takes more time, but you know the result that you're going to get at the end. And that is the process that you offer through this book, is that you've got that initial 2 hours where you can widen and then narrow your search. But then you also have a real precision or precise way of establishing those contacts and then following up, and taking into account the fact that the whole process is so stressful, and that because of the stress, your cortisol levels are increased, therefore making you more forgetful. So calendar items in a specific way, and you've got a whole formula for how to not only do that first outreach, but know when to do the follow-up email, know when to do the second follow-up, and also knowing when to let it go.
Mhm. I think about this stuff a dozen hours a day. Like for 15 plus years, and for many years before that, I was always obsessed with the job search. When I was a student, I thought everybody was crazy for obsessing over statistics or fluid transport, because I just was worried about getting a job at the end of the day. Having spent thousands of hours thinking about this, am in a better position to curate all of the information out there about job searching than someone who's just thinking about it for the first time or for the 10th time, but hasn't really like delved into the research or had a chance to do a bunch of trial and error and see what works on a broader scale. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give everybody that first recipe for lasagna. It's not going to necessarily win any awards, but it will make you lasagna that tastes pretty good. It works for most people most of the time. And then if you realize that worked pretty well, but I like more garlic in my lasagna, you can add more garlic next time. But there's no reason you should try to reinvent the wheel, reinvent the lasagna from scratch. Like that just isn't a great use of your time. And the process is so stressful to begin with. You only have a finite amount of pain tolerance for this process. You need to save energy and shift to autopilot and just following instructions without thinking whenever possible to save that motivation for when you really need it, which is when you're actually talking to people. You need to be able to show that energy, and you need to be able to not feel desperate. You need to be able to get enough of those conversations. You don't need every single one to work out right. The detachment that comes from having options is irresistible to employers. They are very able to sniff out who's got other things going on and who really needs this conversation to work out. And they much prefer the former to the latter, because how you approach your job search is a pretty good indicator of how you're going to approach the job. Do you invest in hope as a strategy, or do you have backup plans? Do you have a strategy that is actually has contingencies for when things don't always go according to your plan?
And the first version of your book was so clear on this plan and how to move forward and how to really get yourself on the right track. So what is different about the first edition of your book and this current edition?
So for the second edition, I think there are a few key changes. The first is that the LAMP process is just much simpler and more, it has been boiled down to its barest essence. So a lot of what I tried to do, I'd had thousands of additional practice reps going through this recipe. And when you cook lasagna 1,000 more times, you have some insight into where you can cut some time or make it a little bit simpler. So the LAMP list is just a much simpler process. That has been widely received positively from the job seekers who've seen the simpler version of the LAMP list compared to the more complex one. Another big change is in the outreach email itself. So I teach something called the 6-point outreach email. It uses social norms to attract a kind of contact I call boosters. I think when you do outreach, you are likely to encounter 3 types of contacts. There's a type of contact that will always ignore you. I call these people curmudgeons. They're awful people. They hate babies. Or they're delightful people who just don't want to interact with job seekers. They're not the worst segment because they are at least honest about not being helpful. The worst segment is the second group, a group I call obligates, who want to appear to be helpful but don't actually want to be helpful. They respond out of a sense of obligation and to avoid losing face. But the net result is that they will drag you along. They'll string you along without actually giving you any benefit. They'll feel like, okay, I've done enough. I've talked to you. Now I don't want to have anything to do with you. The vast majority of help you get from this process comes from this just small group called boosters, who say things like, yes, if you ask me for help, you automatically have a half an hour of my time. The problem is they're only about 15 to 20% of the population. So you've got to go through a lot of people to find those people, to find those boosters. On average, I think if you send 5, 6-point emails, you'll hear back from 2 people, one of which will probably be an obligate and one of which will probably be a booster. So really we're aiming at 20% of the population. But in the first edition of the book, this was called the 5-point email. There, shortly after that book came out, I removed the 5th point, so it was the 4-point email for a long time. And then there were a couple of points I decided to add to make it a little bit simpler. So the 6-point email is just a much more authentic, easier to write, simpler, other-focused rather than self-focused email. So that's been a really, really nice feature as we move more and more towards the importance of authenticity in modern society, especially when we're all so vulnerable, cooped up at home during this pandemic. The ability to ask people for the gift of their time, even when everybody's suffering, in a graceful, comfortable way, is just so helpful. So I'm really excited the 6-point email is making it out in the book now. And the third, I think, third biggest change in the new edition is there's a lot more structure on following up on these conversations. So these informational meetings that wasn't there in the first edition. I didn't know that many people would make it that far in the recipe. So I needed people to actually do the informationals. And then they started having all these wonderful questions about, I've done the informational, now how do I keep in touch with these people over time? So I introduced a follow-up routine called the harvest cycle. So basically, if you rely on your memory, you're going to make many mistakes. So you can't rely on your memory in this process. As you said, you've got to put reminders in your calendar because you're thinking clearly now, right after the conversation ends. You're not thinking clearly a month from now when you're trying to remember who all did I talk to, who do I need to follow up with. So setting reminders now for action in the future is much more effective than trying to log something in a spreadsheet because spreadsheets don't have alarms that notify you. Or relying on your memory when the cortisol fight or flight response is so heavy that your brain is just dumping as much as it can to prepare you just to make it through another day. So the harvest cycle really turns that a lot of things that were in my head when I would talk job seekers through it at Duke and it codifies it into a flow chart, essentially. If then, with pictures. So you can just follow the arrow and know exactly what you're supposed to do with any given contact, both after a conversation ends and when it's time to follow up with them a month later.
Incredible. And you touched a little bit on the pandemic and all the things that are going on right now and how people are both intimidated to reach out and ask for help. So many people are unemployed right now. But at the same time, we're also hearing that there are still employers hiring and that people are even more tuned in now than ever to the importance of helping each other out. So is there any specific guidance that you would give or extra advice during the COVID-19 situation that job seekers can be utilizing?
One of the most interesting dichotomies I've heard from job seekers or I've seen with my job seekers, is that concern about wanting to be sensitive to what's going on with the pandemic. I don't want to reach out because I don't want to burden people who are already burdened. And on the flip side, when they do reach out, their inclination is to sell themselves and talk about themselves. So they don't want to impose, but if they're going to write, they want to impose. So the biggest kind of frame switch that I would encourage among job seekers in this current moment is that you can help people right now just by listening. We are all cooped up in our house. We are not feeling seen or heard. And a lot of people are really nervous about their jobs. So it could be that some of the informationals that you request when you're asked for advice and insight, you just listen a lot to people who are really worried. And that is the selfless, wonderful, good deed that you can do that will earn you an ally for life. And you don't even have to say anything. You just have to let a person know they've been heard. So providing value in your job search, it's not about sending people articles, kind of forcing yourself to like, here's how credible I am. It's just giving people the opportunity to say what's on their mind, to reflect on some good things. A half an hour break in their day where they're not worried about getting laid off. They're instead just sharing with you all of the things that they've learned from their years at their current company. So I think really getting job seekers to see you're not imposing when you adopt the approach that I kind of espouse in the 2-hour job search, where you literally don't ever ask for a job. You don't ever sell yourself. The only time you talk about yourself is when you're asked about yourself. Interested is interesting. The easiest way to get a stranger to care about you is to genuinely care about them. So I give people basically an interview guide for here's questions you can ask a total stranger so that you can use their time wisely to learn and become smarter, but also give them a chance to feel good about all of the expertise that they've developed along the way. So don't feel like you're imposing on people. In fact, they need to be heard now more than perhaps ever in our lifetimes. And you're giving them that gift of just not having an agenda, just being totally selfless and asking them questions that, why are you so good at your job? And then listening for up to a half an hour. That's really what's changed, I think, what should change for maximum success in a pandemic era job search. So don't worry about imposing on people. The people who are a little bit too burdened to talk to you will ignore you, and that's fine. The people who ignore you in the 2-hour job search are doing you a favor. It's the people who don't really want to be there, who feel obligated to talk to you. Often these are alumni of whatever school you attended. That's the danger. I find almost more a higher likelihood of success that if you get a total stranger that you have no connection to via schools or previous companies or friends of friends, if they agree to talk to you, they're more likely to be one of those boosters than the alum who agree to talk to you, because they may just be acting out of the sense of obligation. So don't worry about burdening people. Instead, just worry about using their time wisely and making them feel heard.
Thank you so much, Steve. And to both appreciate and be cognizant of your time, and also the fact and to recognize really that you yourself are a booster. I want to let everybody know that you are available to answer questions and to give comments through your LinkedIn group, the 2-hour job search Q&A group that anyone can join. There are already 5,000 members. And you check that regularly and go in and answer every single question that comes through in a most helpful and incredible way. Is there any other, please go ahead.
I'm very passionate about democratizing the job search. I never really had a bucket list item to write a book, but when I realized that what became the 2-hour job search was helping people, I hated the idea that only Duke students would benefit from it. I love my Duke students. I'm Duke Blue all the way. But for me, I think it's incredibly important that anyone who can, maybe you can't afford the book, maybe you can afford a library card. If you have the wherewithal to want a set of instructions for job searching, for me, I want to be able to support you however I can. So I'm on there practically daily. So please, if you have an experience with this book and you have questions, or you just want to lurk and see what other questions other people have, please join the conversation. It's where I post updates. It's where we have some really interesting conversations, and it makes me smarter too.
Thank you so, so much, Steve, for your time today and for your book. I love it. I want to send it to everybody. I want everybody to know about it, and I want everybody to be able to connect with you and tap into your amazing wisdom and kindness for helping us all through what can be a very stressful time in our lives. So thank you, Steve, for all that.
Thank you for this opportunity, Laura. Great to be here.
Thank you so much.